Well, good morning or evening, depending on where you are in the world. And we are show 4 of our quite exciting El Alamein 80th anniversary set of shows. And today is a bit of a deeper dive after John Parshall's amazing overview, where we ended up talking about Guadalcanal and Malta and all sorts of things, rabbit holes we got stuck down yesterday. But today it's a deeper dive when we're looking at the role of the Australian 9th Infantry. We'll also talk a little bit about artillery and some general principles of warfare. And John kind of advertised this show very well by saying how well regarded the Australians were for their fighting in North Africa. So I'm delighted to bring my guest in. He came on a recommendation from Carl James, who's been on a couple of times, Kokoda Trail, depending on your point of view, recommended Craig Tibbitts. He's a senior historian at the Australian War Memorial, and I'm delighted to bring him in. So where you are, good evening, Craig. How are you today?
Good evening, Paul. I'm very well, thanks. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you for being here. So El Alamein, one of the things we're dealing with is its perception as a subject for historians, but it's also a battle that the public are aware about. It comes loaded with iconic imagery of which we now know some of which is fake. The British soldiers approaching the knocked out tank, that kind of thing. The reaction to it back on the streets of Britain. But today we're bringing you in for the Australian version of that same story, because the Australian role in the desert, perhaps kind of Tobruk, has maybe more fame, infamy possibly. But my first question for you, Craig, is before you were a historian, as I said, a young lad growing up, when did El Alamein pop onto your radar? Is it via kind of popular media, comics and TV shows? Or is it a serious historic event? And when was it?
Well, yeah, fairly early on. I started reading about military history when I was a little boy. In fact, I've still got the first military history book that I ever got, and it was a book called Battle, and it covered from ancient all through to battles in the 1960s. And the World War II one, interestingly enough, that it covered was not Tobruk and it was not El Alamein, it was the Battle of Gazala. So That was my first awareness of war in the desert in the Second World War. But I became interested in it, Monty, Rommel, the Africa Corps, 8th Army, and the role of the Australians. So I read a little bit about it when I was a kid. So I had some awareness of Tobruk and Alamein and the Australian role, but I didn't get. I didn't really study it so much in depth until I started working at the War Memorial. When I started there in the year 2000, and learned quite a lot about it.
And that's interesting that Gazala comes up for an Australian. I mean, it's that national lens that each country has about a battle. And we were talking before going live that in Israel it's seen as the salvation of Palestine. It's also Churchill's political salvation, arguably, because of the lack of confidence in him. He needed to give a victory to the country. So El Alamein is lots of things to lots of people, but we're already going down a rabbit hole of my own making. I'll load up your PowerPoint. Craig has come with a magnificent PowerPoint. We're going to go through the Australian role in the Battle of Alamein. We'll do questions that pertain to the subject we're talking about, so specific about the slides as we go along. But any kind of bigger questions about how Australia sees its role in World War II or the conclusions about the Desert Campaign, we'll perhaps do them at the end there. But basically, I'm going to hand it over to Craig now to take us through the presentation, and I'm really going to sit back and enjoy it. So thanks very much, and over to you, Craig.
Right, thank you, Paul, and welcome to people who are viewing live and to those who catch the show later. I'll just start while I've got this title slide up, this artwork. I'll show it again later. Just start by making a couple of general observations before I get down into the detail. Firstly, I think the fighting at El Alamein in the summer of 1942 was significant. It was one of several turning points in the war's middle year, the latter half of 1942, where the tide began to turn in favour of the Allies. You also think of the battles of Midway, Guadalcanal, Milne Bay, Kokoda out in the Pacific area here, and of course Stalingrad on the Eastern Front. People are often scornfully dismissive of the North African campaign as little more than a sideshow, as they say, of little importance to the war overall. But I disagree with this, and I have for some time. I think North African campaign should be looked at within the context of the Mediterranean theatre overall, and then North Africa becomes a much bigger deal. And it becomes more important as the war progresses into 1943 and onwards. Sure, the scale of the fighting and the forces involved was small compared to that in Europe, but it did become significantly larger towards the end. North Africa, I think, was more of a sideshow for Germany, if not a downright annoyance a lot of the time. But for the Italians and the British, not so. They had vital strategic interests in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. And there were some serious strategic implications had the British lost control of that region. Another thing I think is that the experience the Allies gained in North Africa was important in learning how to fight and defeat the Germans in particular. There were some key lessons learned in tactics, equipment, weapons, but also in things such as all arms cooperation, joint and combined operations, and the use of intelligence and deception. I think many of those things that got their start in North Africa were later improved upon for subsequent campaigns from 1943 onwards. But for the Australians, I think El Alamein is particularly significant, firstly, in that our 9th Division played a prominent and important role, especially in the decisive battle in October, November, and because we played such an important and active role in that battle, it also meant that it was a very costly battle for us. We paid a high price in blood. The Australian 9th Division suffered almost 5,500 casualties at Alamein. That's between July and November when we finished our role there. So I'll just click over to the next slide. This is a quote I always try to keep in mind when thinking about or reading about the North African campaign. And certainly it was never more true than the period at El Alamein in summer 1942. The Western Desert may be the tactician's paradise, but it's the quartermaster's hell. This is General Major Johann von Ravenstein, who was commander of the 21st Panzer Division. He was actually captured by New Zealand troops during Operation Crusader in November 41, so he didn't get to play any part in El Alamein. And of course, the meaning of his quote there is obvious that it's North Africa's great terrain to maneuver and fight battles without rivers, mountains, towns, too many people getting in the way, but it's so difficult to get supplies in and to get them forward. So it's just a simple map of the Mediterranean. As I said before, it's important not to think of North African campaign in isolation. It should be viewed as part of the wider Mediterranean theatre. Yep. One of the things is the distances, the great distances that had to be covered in North Africa. Now, the main bases of supply for Axis, coloured there Tripoli, coloured in red, they're Tripoli, and Alexandria in blue. It's about 1,500 kilometres, but as the crow flies. But by road, it's about, I think it's a little bit over 1,800 kilometres, which is further than from Warsaw to Stalingrad.
Yeah.
And some of the issues in North Africa were very different to more settled places. For example, Europe. There were Tripoli and Alexandria were the only two decent-sized ports. There are a few other smaller ones, such as Benghazi, Derna, Tobruk, which could be used, but they had very, very small, limited capacity to unload shipping, and they were always constantly under air attack as well. And then once on the ground, the rail and the road networks were very, very meagre indeed. Really only one good road along the coast, and only parts of that had any rail at all. So it was very, very difficult. The Battle of the Mediterranean as well. The Allied navies really led the way in the Allied victory in North Africa. It was of great importance, the war at sea in the Med. Very hotly contested, often centred on Malta, but other parts of the Med at various times as well. So the Royal Navy, supported by the Desert Air Force, were key to victory in North Africa, really by interdicting their supplies coming mainly from Italy and Sicily, and they gradually strangled the Axis forces and starved them of supplies. So it's always important to remember the role of the Navy in the Med and the North African campaign. That's when I started to get a deeper interest in 2002, I went on a joint Imperial War Museum, Australian War Museum staff study tour. We actually went to Crete and then to Alamein. So I gave a presentation there on the ground at El Alamein.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it was just wonderful. So that was 2002, around the time of the 60th anniversary of the battle. Yeah, back then I gave a talk about the Australians during the fighting in July at Alamein. So for this talk, I'll just cover that briefly, but I'll concentrate more on the Australians during the decisive battle in October, going into November. That's the railway stop at El Alamein in 1942 on the bottom there. And yes, as you can see, it was still there in 2002. And as far as I know, it's still standing there now.
Yeah.
That slide there, I include that to just give an idea of the terrain there. The landscape looking southward hasn't changed much at all. Along the coastal strip there's now lots of hotels, resorts, and rows of holiday apartments. But yes, it's just fairly flat with only a few minor ridges and soft, sandy sort of ground, difficult to dig into, and just these little tufts of vegetation. That's me actually just giving my talk in 2002 at Tel El Isa. We weren't allowed to get right onto that position. Tel El Isa is just a little bit further west than El Alamein station itself. It became a key position during the fighting there. When I was there, we couldn't get right onto Tel El Isa because the danger of mines was still there. The Axis forces planted some 500,000 mines on the Alamein line, and then on top of that, there was the ones the Allies put there too. And when I was there last 20 years ago, the Egyptian army was clearing mines in the area, and they're probably still at it today.
I expect so.
Yeah. So just quickly on the precursor to it, after the 8th Army was defeated at Gazala and then quickly lost to Tobruk, they were sent into headlong retreat back into Egypt and stabilised on the El Alamein line, which at the time was still only partially developed as a series of boxes. It wasn't quite as solid as a line as it was anticipated to be. So the 8th Army sort of got there in pretty ragged order. The 9th Division at the time was stationed in Syria and Palestine, and they were rushed back to the front at El Alamein right at the end of June to help stabilise the line there. They arrived on the 7th of July, and then on the 10th of July, they made an important attack. You can see just along the coast, there is an arrow that goes right along the coast and then hooks into a place called Tel El Isa. So the Australians managed to seize that really important parcel of land along the coast, which is a ridge and also a height, Tel El Isa. It would become key to holding the coastal sector. When they did that, they also happened to capture Rommel's best radio intercept unit, which is called NFAK, Nachrichtenfern Aufklärungscompany number 621. Took them by surprise and either killed or captured pretty much all of them. So that deprived Rommel of an important intelligence asset at that time. So the Australians remained in that position on the coast and defended that coastal strip, held off numerous counterattacks, and the enemy really tried very hard to get that ground back, but we held on to it. We then, along with other units that were there, participated in some failed operations a bit further to the south on Mitaria or Ruin Ridge in mid-July, and then again at the end of the month. And British, South Africans, New Zealanders and ourselves suffered some pretty bad losses trying to gain hold of that ridge unsuccessfully. On the 22nd of July, we made an attempt to capture the west point of the Tel El Isa feature. And that's where the first Victoria Cross was won by an Australian at El Alamein by Private Stan Gurney of the 2nd 48th Battalion. At the end of August, going to September, there was what some people refer to as the Second Battle of El Alamein, but it's generally known as the Battle of Alam el Halfa, where Rommel made another move to swing wide around the British 8th Army, around their flank, and get past them. That failed. The Australian involvement, the Australians were still up on the coast, and they had a diversionary attack which they put in on 1st of September, which didn't gain a lot. We killed and captured quite a few Germans, but we also suffered a fair few killed and wounded and POWs ourselves. So that was just a summary of the fighting that the Australians were involved in. As I said, I'll concentrate more on the October-November battle. So just a few figures in the Australian picture here. In the centre there is a photo of Lieutenant General Leslie Morshead. He was the commander of the Australian 9th Division at the time, and had been since earlier in 1941, and was commander of them at Tobruk, had been ever since. He was a First World War veteran. He'd fought at Lone Pine at Gallipoli and ended up commanding an infantry battalion on the Western Front. He wasn't a professional soldier. He was really just a citizen soldier, but he participated between the wars in the militia forces. And so his defence of Tobruk during the siege the previous year, 1941, had really enhanced his reputation. And I see him as Australia's best fighting general. The other images there show Morshead with Montgomery during Monty's mercifully brief phase with wearing the Australian slouch hat, festooned with a variety of regimental badges. I think it might have been Lumsden, who wasn't a big fan of Monty, who referred to him at this time of arsing about with silly hats. But I think
he ends up with a bit of a track record for arsing about with silly hats, does Montgomery, doesn't he? Yeah, it's. But just to interrupt while we've got you on about Montgomery, is that one of the things that has come up and will come up repeatedly is the change of attitude Montgomery brings in when he takes over from the Ork in August. And in terms of the Australian view of the situation generally, and maybe perhaps in terms of morale, did Montgomery's arrival change things much from an Australian point of view, because he wasn't their commanding officer in the way he was for the British? So, how would you define what he brings to the Australian outlook?
Yeah, I think definitely they viewed him very positively. Certainly, from Morshead and officers of the 9th Division down to ordinary soldiers, remarked that this fellow's a breath of fresh air, and we feel like things are in hand now. And then he's a lot more definite with his communications and plans, and then instigating a lot of very hard training as well, which appealed to Morshead. Morshead himself was a very hard trainer of his men. He was Montgomery was viewed pretty positively by and large by the Australians.
Okay, thanks.
The other image there is that's Morshead meeting Churchill, and that's on the 5th of August. Churchill was always impatient of the 8th Army to go over to the attack. He'd come out to light a fire under those in charge. In fact, he sacked Auchinleck the following day after meeting with Morshead there, and appointed Strafer Gott in his place. But as most would probably know, he met an unfortunate end the very next day when his plane was intercepted by German fighters and he was killed. So that made way for Montgomery to take command of the 8th Army. Okay, getting down a bit further, these are who I call Morshead's lieutenants, really. Senior officers, really, but these are his key staff members. So Chief Staff GSO-1, Colonel Henry Wells, his artillery chief, Brigadier Alan Ramsey, and his engineer commandos, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Risson. They'd all had fairly extensive experience. Some had First World War experience as well. Not all were professional soldiers. In fact, Wells and Ramsey were not. Sorry, Wells was. Ramsey and Risson were not. Ramsey was a school teacher, actually. But yes, they'd had quite a lot of experience, joined the AIF, the second AIF in the Second World War, and they'd been working with Morshead in the 9th Division for quite some time, and they're very, very effective in their roles. These are the brigade commanders, the infantry brigade commanders, being an infantry division. That's kind of the core of the fighting force. So again, fairly experienced men, a little younger, except Brigadier Godfrey. He'd had First World War experience. Yes, and they'd been in charge of their brigades for not quite as long. Godfrey had been. He'd been there in Tobruk. The others had taken, those slightly younger men had taken over from older brigadiers not too long before Alamein, but just in time to, get experience. But they were very experienced infantry commanders. Windire had commanded the 2nd 48th Infantry Battalion, and Whitehead had commanded the 2nd Machine Gun Battalion previously. And they were very, very highly respected officers in their role. Always like to mention the Desert Air Force as well, like with the Navy. The Desert Air Force played a vital role at Alamein as well throughout the entire 4 to 5 months on the Alamein line. They made relentless attacks on Rommel's Panzer Army during their pursuit of 8th Army from Gazala all the way back to Alamein, and really made a bit of a difference in harassing them as they were being chased back there. At Alam el Halfa at the end of August, they absolutely pummeled and hammered Rommel's attempt to outflank the 8th Army there. It had a lot to do with its defeat. During the October-November fighting, the Desert Air Force were there every day and every night, and by which time they'd gained almost complete air superiority and took a heavy toll on the Panzer Army. From an Australian perspective, it's also worth noting that plenty of Australians served in the Desert Air Force as well, and they fought and died over Alamein, serving with both RAAF and RAF squadrons. Important not to forget that role. I just use this slide here just to illustrate that while the Axis forces were a mixed German and Italian army, their opponents were much more diverse in their makeup. As the map shows, it was largely a Commonwealth effort with 8th Army, but as those flags show, there are also Greeks and Free French present as well. And if you consider the Desert Air Force, which I just mentioned, that was also multinational and even included, by the time of Alamein, some American squadrons participating in the fighting, both bombing and fighter squadrons. The photo I've included there, I've cheated a bit. That's not from Alamein, it's from Tobruk, but it's just kind of nicely illustrates some of the Commonwealth nations present. Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Rhodesians, Indians, and British. So yes, definitely a Commonwealth affair, but really an Allied affair with more than just the Commonwealth involved. These are just some slides. I won't spend too much time on those, but that's just the composition of 8th Army. And as you can see, 9th Australian Division is in 30 Corps under Oliver Leese. And this is going to be the attacking corps for the second decisive battle in October, November, to try and make the breakthrough for the armour to come through after them. Just a quick overview of the 9th Division's composition. As you can see, they've got cavalry, machine guns, pioneers, artillery, anti-tank, engineers, and then the 3 infantry brigades are really the strength of it.
Just to jump in, because John Marshall yesterday, Craig, said about the Australian and New Zealand influence into the artillery program and General Kirkman sort of seeing what was going on there. You know, we tend to think of the 9th as being an infantry formation, but with their artillery contribution as well, and the Australian combined arms approach, do you think that was something that was significant and that was definitely an area the Australians had been kind of breaking ground in over the previous few months?
Yeah, I think so. My impression is that the Australian artillery, organic to the 9th Division, was performed very, very well. But as part of a much bigger army artillery program, really. And I think you mentioned Kirkman, wasn't it? He was the CRE of the army. I think they knew how to do artillery in the British way, so they were able to plug in and just fit into that system very, very well. Equipment's all the same, training's all the same. So I think that they fit in very well and perform very, very nicely indeed. Just a quick overview of the Panzer Army Africa. I mean, really what you're looking at is about roughly a dozen divisions on each side, although by the time of the 23rd of October, we were outnumbered the Axis in men, guns, tanks, aircraft, about 2 to 1, because a lot of those Axis divisions were much smaller. I think just getting back to the size of divisions and some being depleted, one important factor about the Australian 9th Division at this point was that they'd been upguarding the border in Syria, the Turkish-Syria border, and also in Palestine for some time after they'd been at Tobruk. So by this stage, they'd been rested and replenished, so they were full strength. It was an important factor, as other divisions that had retreated from Gazala were in a pretty depleted state. Another reason why the 9th Division, I think, was very welcome addition to the 8th Army at this critical juncture was that they were experienced in desert fighting. They'd also had a lot of experience fighting against Rommel's armoured forces at Tobruk, and they were pretty confident in their tactics. They weren't intimidated. In fact, they were pretty confident going against the enemy. That's certainly my impression. I like to include this one just to show what slit trenches were like at Alamein. As I think I mentioned before, it was pretty difficult to dig into the ground there. So that's the one that those two Germans are lying in is actually not too bad a one at all. Sometimes you're lucky if you could scrape out 12 or 18 inches to get a little bit of cover. So a lot of particularly on the ridges, it was more rocky as well. Difficult to get any sort of depth to your slit trench, and you really needed it because in daytime, anything moving above ground was going to get shot at. Second Battle of El Alamein is just a quick overview of it there. So it ran from the 23rd of October to the 4th of November 1942. It was named Operation Lightfoot, and there was a few phases of Lightfoot break-in operations on the night of the 23rd and Crumbling operations, which I'll talk a bit more over the next few days. The Axis response in counter-attacks, which went on repeatedly for several days until the breakthrough was finally made with Operation Supercharge. As you can see on that map there, up in the north, you can see there's two dotted lines. They're supposed to be the channels which were cleared through enemy minefields, wire, defences for the armour to get through. That was the plan, to get through in that northern sector, which was basically all done by 30 Corps. That's just a map there. So with the battle kicked off on the 23rd of October at exactly 9:40 p.m. on the 23rd, the Allied artillery barrage of almost 900 guns opened up simultaneously. For 15 minutes, they pounded the enemy positions and suddenly stopped. 5 minutes later, at exactly 10 p.m., they opened up again with even greater intensity than before, and the infantry got up out of their holes in the ground and advanced. So while 13 Corps in the south launched some supporting attacks and diversionary attacks, the main thrust, as I mentioned, was 30 Corps, which is this map here is just showing all the 30 Corps objectives. So a raid north to south over the Australian 9th, 51st Highland, 2nd New Zealand, 1st South African, and 4th Indian divisions. They were to break into the enemy positions and create those two separate lanes for 10 Corps armour to come through. They were to establish a strong bridgehead by dawn on what they called the Oxalic line on this far side of the second mine belt. So once the infantry reached the minefields, the minesweepers, reconnaissance corps troops and sappers moved in and started working on these passages for the armour to get through. 9 Div sappers actually lost 30 killed or wounded on that first night. So not a pleasant job. But progress was a bit slower than planned, and at 2 a.m. the next morning, the first of 500 tanks had started to crawl forward. A couple of hours later, they were in the minefields, and there was just so much dust and smoke and confusion. There was visibility was terrible, and there was traffic jams all over the place, and they basically got bogged down in that spot. Another interesting thing that happened on the Australian front was, as people would know, Rommel was actually away from the front. I think he was in Germany at the time, getting some medical treatment. So General Stummer, who was in charge of the Panzer Army, he was fired at, presumably from the Australian sector. He was in his staff car or something like that. And he fell off the vehicle when they were fired upon and died of a heart attack, it seems. So they were leaderless for a while until Rommel returned. But only about half the infantry attained their objectives, and none of the tanks had broken through. As you can see, one brigade in each of those divisional efforts has got to the objective line, and the other ones come up a little bit short. But they achieved those other objectives within the next day or two. There was also a composite force that was operating between Tel El Isa on the 26th Australian Brigade's flank, just because it was in the air a bit. You'll notice that the northern flank along the coast, there's no attack there. The 24th Australian Brigade is actually just sitting pat and holding that sector, while the other two attack a little bit to the south of the coast. Just also notice that little red triangle I've marked up onto this map there. That's trig point 29. And it was actually a little bit outside the first night's objectives, but it would soon become the focus of very intense fighting, as its elevation gave excellent views of the whole northern sector of the front. So both sides wanted that really badly. That's the trig 29 is what the Germans referred to as Hill 28.
And just while we got that map up on screen, Craig, and the New Zealand forces are on there, and the Indian forces, a question that came up earlier from regular viewer Ian Carr, because people like myself, as a British historian, we would often lump in the non-British forces into the same sentence. So we would say the Australian, New Zealand, and Indian forces. Ian's specific question is how close or otherwise were Freiburg and Morshead? I mean, at the time, did the New Zealand and Australian divisions see themselves as very much a pairing, or were they just consider themselves part of a general 8th Army? How close was the relationship?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure how close personally Morshead and Freiburg were. I don't know that they'd had much interaction prior to El Alamein. I may be wrong, but I don't think so. And my impression is really that they didn't really see themselves as like a subset or like an Anzac force within.
I think
they saw themselves more as just a part of a Commonwealth force, really.
Yeah, I think that's very much the British and American way of you and I know Carl James is kind of frustrated that when a British historian mentions Australia and his in-force, they have to mention both or not at all. You always get lumped in together. It's never treated as a separate force. It's and a part of that is the pride of Anzac Day and the pride of that Anzac Day concept. But in this situation, I think it's intriguing that and Glenn Harper will be on tomorrow at the same time. At the time that the New Zealand Australian force didn't necessarily consider themselves part of a pairing.
No, not really. No, I don't think so at El Alamein so much. I mean, the closest really to that was the ill-fated Greek campaign.
Yeah.
and subsequently Crete as well, where Australians and New Zealanders were a substantial part of the force there too. But both of those didn't go well. So.
Yeah, that's another rabbit hole we're not going to go down today. But amazing stuff, and we'll carry on. So back to you. Just that was a question I wanted to ask there. Then we
sure, no worries. Just before I go on, I'll just quickly want to emphasise the massive and vital role that artillery played at El Alamein. There was a lot of it there, and it was firing all the time. For the pre-attack bombardment on 23rd of October, 8th Army artillery numbered almost 900 guns. And during the 12 days of battle commencing on 23rd of October, 8th Army's artillery fired more than 1 million rounds. And that's just the 25-pounder, the most common field piece that was there. And the heaviest concentrations, unsurprisingly, was where the main action was, in the northern sector of the 30 Corps front. In many ways, the decisive battle at El Alamein was much like a big battle on the Western Front in the First World War. There's no opportunity to outflank, fixed positions with head-on attacks by multiple divisions in line, massive artillery support using First World War tactics such as predicted fire, sound ranging, flash spotting, survey. They had even better aerial reconnaissance, photographic reconnaissance as well, and the use of things such as creeping barrages, standing barrages, box barrages, that sort of thing, all that stuff that had been developed in the First World War. So in many ways, it was very much like a big battle on the Western Front, and also entrenched positions protected by barbed wire. But I would argue, when I think about it more, that Alamein was even more intense in 1942 than in the Western Front in 1917 or 18. Because if you consider that in addition to what I just mentioned, on the El Alamein battlefield, there was all that plus far more mobile and lethal tanks, and hundreds of them roaming the battlefield. There were extensive minefields. You remember I mentioned that the Axis planted 500,000 mines there. The minefields, as the Germans called them, Devil's Gardens, were booby traps. Nasty stuff. And of course, there was far more volume and lethality in the attacks from the aircraft as well than in the First World War. So to me, it just seems as a far more intense, lethal battlefield than even a First World War one on the Western Front. So, because they didn't get through on the first night or early the next morning, the tactics that they then went with, which were planned, were what was referred to crumbling. So while the Australians were holding off enemy counterattacks, they were now tasked with resuming their attacks, but this time turning northwards, as those arrows indicate, advancing towards the coast. So this move was intended to crumble away at the enemy infantry strength and threaten to cut off their forces on the coast. As Monty put it, I think at the time, to eat the guts out of the enemy, I think he said. So increasingly fierce fighting ensued as the Australians pushed and ground their way forward, and most Australian casualties would occur during this phase of the fighting because their progress drew upon them Rommel's best troops and strongest armoured units, in fact, the entire Africa Corps. On the night of the 25th, 26th, the 26th Brigade moved west to capture the vital high ground on Trig 29, and then drove north. Then they drove northwards to the fig orchard. There was a very innovative attack by C Company of the 2nd 48th Battalion, who arrived on Trig 29 just on the heels of an artillery barrage in Bren gun carriers. And they jumped out on the objective and then engaged in very fierce hand-to-hand fighting. It took the German defenders by surprise. There was a German strong point just near Trig 29 that was giving a lot of trouble. And it was then that Private Percy Gratwick of the 2nd 48 won the Victoria Cross that night for charging a nearby that enemy strong point that had his company pinned down. So with grenades and bayonet, he eliminated the enemy posts, but it cost him his life. And that's him, Private Percy Gratwick.
And would it be fair to say that in Australia, Craig, because of it being one division's role, you are able to focus in on some of these smaller actions, like the Fig Orchard and the Saucer and Thompson's Post and what have you, because whereas the British maybe see it as a more sweeping kind of operational level battle, where we talk about these hundreds of tanks and thousands of guns, things like that, whereas your focus is a little bit more low end on these individual Victoria Cross actions, for example.
Yeah, that's right. It's when there's you don't have such a huge amount of units or men involved, you can focus a bit more on the actions of individual units and companies and battalions and that sort of thing. Yeah. So that's good, and that's sort of always been a bit of a hallmark of the Australian official histories as well. First World War, Second World War, they're able to dig down a bit deeper into the actions of battalions, companies, and even individuals as well, more so than could be done in an official history of a nation such as Britain that had so many more. Yeah,
I mean, it came up yesterday where there's somewhere between 300 and 500 books about El Alamein, and they vary in quality and readability, but of course a lot of them are rather dry overviews. They try and summarize, as we're doing today, the maritime campaign, the Desert Air Force, the first battle, second battle, and in reading it, it's lots of arrows on maps and very little kind of charging machine gun positions with bayonets.
Yes,
I think even those of us that love the tactics, we still do need those kind of hair-raising stories to get us involved. And I think that's why when we talk about the Australians or New Zealanders, you can kind of focus in on more of these inspirational stories about individual bravery that I think are important, along with the studies of the tactics and the doctrine.
It's also important too that especially some of the older books brought out a lot of personal voices, more so the British, with some of the other books that I've looked at that have been published in, let's say, in the last 20 years or so, they make good use of personal writing, letters, postcards, diaries. So you don't only get those individual actions, but also what men were thinking and feeling before battle, after battle, that sort of thing. And there's more awareness these days, more understanding, appreciation of what war and battle does to men's minds as well, and how it can affect them.
Well, it came up in the sidebar earlier, Craig, about the white feathers, and that's something that when I did a show with Mark Johnson a year or so ago about the company he wrote about, is that
yes, I saw that one. Yes.
As a Brit, I had no idea that, and for those who don't know what we're talking about, it's the fact that there are Australians in the country who believe that an Australian fighting in North Africa or Mediterranean on the Air Force is somehow not defending Australia properly because they're going off overseas, and that these pilots and these guys in Tobruk are receiving white feathers from anonymous members of the public, and that was a real kind of mind-blowing moment for me.
It is shocking, isn't it? Yeah, and little do these silly people at home realise that the guys out on the Alamein line are fighting far more intense battle than ever going to be fought in the Pacific.
Yeah, and they are absolutely fighting for Australia, because it's indirectly rather than directly. But as you know, nothing happens in a vacuum. The thing about what we talk about on this channel is that everything is connected. Is that what's happening in the Mediterranean is affecting the Pacific, what's happening in there is affecting the Atlantic convoys, and so on and so forth. And so to consider that Australians, you know, stuck in some miserable shell scrape in Tobruk or later in Alamein charging for a minefield are somehow not serving Australia properly is ridiculous. But
why blame the soldiers? I mean, the soldiers don't get to choose where they're deployed.
Exactly. If you have got a grievance with the Australian policy, take it out with the Australian government, not some poor digger sitting in a hole. But anyway, it's a fantastic side. A bit of detail, as shocking as it is. But back to you and the story.
All right. So over the next 2 days, the Australians endured and repulsed some 25 enemy attacks to try and retake Trig 29. Most of them supported by tanks, and Stuka dive bombing and artillery. So they had a lot on their hands to hold on to that miserable lump of ground in the middle of the desert. But it was key ground. They held on thanks largely to they could just call on massive artillery support to break up the infantry attacks and also deter the panzer attacks, and also very good anti-tank gun support. Mixed. They had them in positions with them on those forward areas, the anti-tank guns. By that time, they had a lot of the 6-pounder anti-tank guns, which they hadn't had previously, and they were much, much better. They could knock out most of the German tanks and certainly Italian ones. So they'd survived there with that support, but also their own grim determination, I would say. Then for several days that went on. The night of the 31st of October, the Australians drove forward again heading north, driving deeper and deeper, biting into the heart of the enemy defences. This was really just to buy time for the armour to be reorganised for another attempt to break through, but also to, as I mentioned before, to deplete the German and Italian infantry that was in this area, and to try and cut off those that were forward of that area, but also to try and draw the German and Italian armour, the bulk of it, up to that sector there, so that they would not be deployed in the way of the British armoured breakthrough that would come a little to the south. It wasn't very much when the breakthrough came. It was only just slightly to the south of there. It wasn't much to the south. So just something to be aware of. So the Australians again battled forward through the fig orchard to Thompson's Post, across the railway line, and then to a large depression, which was nicknamed a saucer. It became the scene of some even more intense and bitter fighting. The 2nd 32nd Battalion captured a railway workers' hut called the Blockhouse, and that actually ended up becoming an aid post where both German and Australian doctors worked side by side over several days in the middle of the battlefield. Just as a side note, there's something that's often associated with the North African campaign, was that it was a clean campaign, a war without hate, conducted with honour and chivalrous behaviour. I would only say that from everything I've read about the campaign, you do see numerous accounts of chivalry and fair treatment, but you'll also find plenty of cases of nastiness too. Trickery, killing of prisoners, shooting at stretcher bearers and ambulances, and sometimes no quarter shown. So it's a bit of a fallacy to think it was just North Africa was a clean war between Germans and Brits.
I think that kind of falls into that post-war revision. The German officers who are out there, the ones who are disassociating themselves from Hitler and the SS, and the Rommel idea of it being noble, and we get the same thing with the Luftwaffe. It's that aspect there. But I've got an interesting 2-part question from regular viewer Ernest Malley, and it's about the Australian aggression that's being shown in this battle. He says, It's the first part. David Horner cites AIF 16,000 reinforcements in theatre by late 1941, effectively off the books, allotted to units. A fair few are held over when the AIF leaves for home. And the second part is, does Craig think this ability to make good losses or take good losses in a way the New Zealand and South African divisions can't make him, meaning Morshead, more willing to be aggressive at El Alamein?
Yeah, so what was the first part again?
So the first part was about the 16,000 AIF off the books.
Yeah. So yeah, we certainly were full strength. In fact, over strength if you count the pool of replacements that were available at the time. Look, to some degree, I suppose, if you've got a full strength or over strength division, you can go in a bit harder with them. I'm not sure that was particularly Morshead's or maybe even Lisa's or Montgomery's thinking. They valued them as the quality troops that they were. My impression really is that there was a couple of factors as to why the Australians went in very hard at El Alamein, and some of it's got to do with pride and confidence. As I mentioned before, they were pretty confident that they could beat the Afrika Korps. They'd had experience and done pretty well against them, particularly dealing with their armoured attacks in Tobruk. So there was a level of confidence, and I think, as I mentioned, I might not have mentioned this yet, but there was quite a lot of sentiment among the Australians when they came back to the El Alamein front. They were really pretty pissed off that Tobruk had been lost.
Yeah. It came up yesterday. It's got an element of the Canadians in Normandy post Dieppe. There's an element of revenge, setting a wrong to right, getting their own back. That perhaps some of the other divisions involved don't have that direct personal feeling about the battle that the Aussies and the New Zealanders, I guess, certainly the Aussies have to some extent.
Yeah, and they hadn't. See, the other funny thing is that the 9th Division hadn't really been part of 8th Army previously. They'd only joined them in July. So
but that's the same thing applied to the Canadians in Normandy. Very few had any involvement directly in Dieppe, but as a nation, there's that sense that they'd taken a bloody nose and they wanted to get their own back. So it's certainly in my reading about El Alamein, it's something I attribute to the Australians is a real sense of wanting to get their own back.
I think so. And you've got to understand about the 9th Division at that time as well. They'd lost quite a few men at Tobruk, so while they were full strength and had an overstrength pool of replacements, there was some men that had been at Tobruk and were much more experienced veterans, but there was quite a few men in the division that hadn't fought before. They were new blokes. This was their first battle, and some of the units, not all of 9th Division's units had actually been in Tobruk either. I think, for example, 2nd Machine Gun Battalion was not there. Sometimes it does amaze me with the grit and determination and resolve with which they carried out these attacks. And I think, why did you push so hard? Why, sometimes even just one description just makes me shake my head that they virtually just advanced onto the enemy guns, and most of them got knocked over, and the last guy standing would bayonet the German machine gunner. I don't know how much of an exaggeration that is, but it just sort of one that stuck in my mind. Where was I up to?
Sorry, we went down a couple of rabbit holes then. Yeah, we were talking about the I think I
was talking about the misconception that it was always a clean war.
Yeah, that's right, the clean war. Yeah.
So with these attacks deeper and deeper and deeper into the enemy position in the north, the battalions of the 26th Brigade in particular were now severely depleted, and as that map indicates, they actually advanced first northwards, then they advanced back eastwards. So they were actually coming back towards their own guns. They advanced out to Thompson's Post but then they were just so weak in numbers that they couldn't hold on, so they had to retreat back towards the saucer there, really. So they were critically low in numbers and they were unable to, they had to pull back. Once again, during this attack on the 31st, a man of the 2nd 48th Battalion, Sergeant Bill Kibbe, he went above and beyond the call of duty and sacrificed himself to save the pinned down remnants of his company. Again, this is a case of one man taking matters into his own hands and charging multiple German strongpoints with bayonet and grenade. And his was another posthumous Victoria Cross. They all were, all the Australian ones were at El Alamein. Kibbe was not a young man. He was 39 years old. And the other chap, Gratwick, that I mentioned previously, he was 40. So they're older blokes.
There's hope for us old
yeah. Yes, I wish I could go back to 40, but anyway, that's another matter.
I go backwards. Yeah.
So yeah, I think I mentioned this that there was a pretty steely resolve among the Australian forces at El Alamein. The Australian infantry units committed to this battle were so low in numbers that Morshead now decided to send in the 2nd 3rd Pioneer Battalion to continue the attack across the road to Barrel Hill. Actually, I'll just dart back to the... you see, right at the top of that map, you'll see a line where the 2nd 3rd Pioneer Battalion is sent forward right to the other side of the saucer area, and they end up in a very, very exposed position. And by dawn on the 31st, the pioneers who were actually fighting in their first infantry battle, because the infantry battalions were so depleted, they brought the pioneers in, who were trained as field engineers and infantry, but this was their first infantry battle. Very terribly exposed, and fighting continued throughout the day. At one point, the German officer came forward to them with a white flag and suggested to the pioneers that they should surrender. And the response he got was, "If you want us, come and get us." And so the Germans resumed their attack, a tank attack, and the fighting raged on throughout the day. And then just at the time when the German panzers appeared to finish off the pioneers in their exposed position, some British tanks arrived. And so the pioneers just basically had to hug the dirt as an enormous tank battle erupted all around them and over their heads. And eventually the British tanks and the anti-tank guns, there was also some Southern Rhodesian anti-tank gunners that helped very much. They were brought into the Australian position there too, and they did some very good shooting, drove off the panzers, and the Australians still held the ground. So that artwork there is an occurrence a little further to the south of where the pioneers were, the 2nd 32nd holding off a panzer attack. And here's a picture here of the 2nd 3rd Pioneers in the battlefield at that time. I think they're just near that's after they pulled back from that very exposed situation in the saucer and back to the railway embankment. So,
and you can see in that photo how even a minor little kind of almost ditch or kind of dip there suddenly becomes an important position because of that inability to dig in, and how if you're there at the battlefield now, it all sort of looks flat, but these little low points could be so crucial. Yes,
that's right. You got to use any bit of ground that you can to get cover behind. Yes, but that's the railway embankment, so that was the man-made one.
Yeah.
So the next night, Morshead conducted a very difficult and risky move with the 26th Brigade now so few in numbers and at the end of their endurance, really. Overnight, the 24th Brigade, which had been holding the coastal salient, was brought in to take their place. So for a few hours, the Australian sector was highly vulnerable to a German breakthrough, had they known what was happening, but they didn't, and so the relief of an entire brigade switched out for another one in the middle of the night was affected. Tanks of our divisional cavalry were put on standby to repulse any German move had they got wind of what was going on and tried to make a breakthrough of their own. Another observation, I think, is the Australians were very good at night operations. The Africa Corps, not so. And I think that's something you realise about the Allied operations in October and November. That's got a lot to do with the training they did in September and earlier in October. And the 8th Army as a whole, not just the Australians, became a lot better at night operations. They do most of their attacking at night time. The Axis tended to do most of their major attacks during the day.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think 8th Army at this stage had a pretty clear advantage over the enemy in night operations, and the Australians certainly were of that opinion as well. So, the 9th Division just had to hold on for one more day, the 1st of November, really, before the reorganised British armour would once more attempt to break through, the decisive breakthrough. So again, they endured during the 1st of November very strong attacks to try and dislodge them from where they were. But by early on the morning of the 2nd of November, the Germans gave up because the way to the south, things were happening. Operation Supercharge, as you can see, that those lines moving to the west there, led by the 2nd New Zealand Division, I might add, with tanks from the 9th Brigade attached. Started the breakthrough. They didn't break through straight away. It still took another 2 days to bash their way through. But the 9th Armoured Brigade that was attached to the Kiwis sacrificed itself essentially that day, losing nearly all of its tanks. But by now the enemy defences had begun to actually crack. And 2 days later, 10 Corps tanks broke through and the Axis line was finally shattered. And on the afternoon of 4th of November, Rommel ordered a full retreat. One of the brigadiers that I mentioned was killed or mortally wounded, I should say. Brigadier Godfrey of the 24th Brigade. On that last day before the Supercharge breakthrough, his forward headquarters, which was well forward, actually pretty close to the saucer, I think, was hit by artillery and he died of his wounds 3 days later. He's the most senior Australian officer killed at Alamein. So, yes, ultimately a breakthrough and victory, defeat and surrender. Well, ultimately it was a decisive Allied victory, no doubt about that. From then on, Axis forces in North Africa were doomed, I think. They retreated all the way back to Western Libya, and then as the Allies in Northwest Africa landed in Northwest Africa on the 8th of November, so just a few days after Rommel had gone into full retreat, and then they withdrew up into Tunisia. They were trapped between two Allied armies and finally cornered in May 1943, where estimates range from 230 to 250,000 Italian and German troops surrendered at Tunis. So that was another major blow to the Axis at that point in the war, not far on the heels of what happened at Stalingrad. Africa Corps POWs behind the wire there. Just some captured by the Australians. 8th Army's casualties for the decisive battle at Al Alamein totaled 13,560. Rommel's Panzer Army lost some 60,000. Of those, about 35,000, I think, were taken prisoner. Again, estimates vary, but some say 30 or some say 35,000. Just quickly, the Australians did actually have an armoured unit at Al Alamein. It's a 9th Division Cavalry Regiment. So they had a mixture of Crusaders and Stuarts and lots of Bren gun carriers. So about 20 tanks and 50 carriers. They saw some limited action at the July fighting and also during that diversionary raid on 1st September. But they didn't see a great deal of action, though. For the decisive battle, they were held in divisional reserve and provided protection for 9th Division headquarters. But they did, on the 4th, the 5th of November, they did lead a pursuit along the coast road, but they were called back because the Australians were being pulled out. So they didn't see a great deal of action, but they were there and they took some casualties. Getting close towards the end now. This is one of my favourite Alamein pictures. He's not an Australian. It's a British Tommy, giving the V for victory sign, or perhaps the alternate meaning of it. But by that, I don't really mean any disrespect to Germans or Italians who fought bravely there. To me, this image is just indicative of how, after Ad el Alamein, the tables had finally turned. After the Africa Corps had given us a runabout for nearly 2 years, I think there was a feeling in 8th Army that, we've got your measure now, Jerry, the boot's on the other foot, So that's kind of what that image means to me. Just summing up, I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, Australian casualties. So the whole time they were there, almost 5,500 casualties, of whom 1,259 died. Roughly half in the July fighting and half in the October-November battle. That's just a breakdown there. So 620 killed in the second battle. But at the second battle, that amounted to 1/5 of 8th Army's casualties. Now I should also point out that that's high, but it's higher if you consider the Air Force, because those figures there are just 9th Division casualties. Yeah. So we know that some Australians fighting in the skies above Alamein were killed as well. And then, as I've been exploring a bit lately, looking at Roll of Honour records and Commonwealth War Grave records and that sort of thing, the Alamein deaths continued in the subsequent days, weeks, months. So it's probably a few hundred higher, I would estimate. Guys dying, in hospitals back in Alexandria or Palestine or closer to Alamein in days, weeks, months, or sometimes even further. You get hit on the 23rd of October, but you might not die for a couple of months or something like that.
Yeah, good point.
So it's that's the same case with most battles. Is the estimate of how many they lost is always a bit under, because all the guys that they haven't counted or haven't yet died when they make their estimate. Memorials. So that's just the German memorial. Do you need me to finish up soon, Paul?
No, we're good. We're good. We might as well keep it going. Yeah.
Okay. No, I'm getting pretty close to the end anyway, so I won't skip through them then, if that's okay. So these are Axis memorials. These are on the coastal ridge that the Australians captured in July. One on point 24, which is near where the German signals intercept unit was captured. That's like in the style of a medieval sort of fortress, the Egyptian German flag there, and it's an ossuary as well. I must see if I've got more photos of that, but I don't remember a great deal of the detail of what was inside. But typical sort of pretty somber mood about it. The Italian memorial, that's on Trig Point 33, further along the coast. It's much brighter, as you can see, much larger, much more ostentatious. It has a mausoleum with 5,200 tombs, some of them known and named and others unknown. The Commonwealth War Cemetery in El Alamein, it's the most beautiful one I've ever seen, is the one at Suda Bay in Crete. But this one, even though at El Alamein, even though there's no beautiful green grass and the sky is often dirty, and this has a real beauty all of its own, I think. So one worthwhile visiting if you get a chance to get over there.
Yeah.
So it contains the graves of men who died at all stages of the Western Desert campaigns, but especially the greater number of those who died at El Alamein. And so there's 7,240 Commonwealth burials from the Second World War. Most of them are identified. There's only a small number that are not. There's also a memorial for those soldiers and airmen. There's almost 12,000 names on the Alamein Memorial, therefore those that have no named grave. or completely unidentified. And there's also a small cremation memorial too. So it's a total of nearly 20,000 either buried or commemorated there. The 9th Division Memorial, which is pictured in this slide here, that's just adjacent to the entry of the Commonwealth War Cemetery. So you'll see that when you visit the cemetery. So yeah, just to recap significance for Australians, I think El Alamein was a significant battle of the Second World War. It was the biggest and most important of the North African campaign, I think. Australians played a prominent and important role, especially 10th of July when they captured that coastal ridge, and really throughout all of the Second Battle of El Alamein in October, November. It was a very costly battle, as I just said, nearly 5,500 casualties, including 1,259 at least, plus a few more if you count the others, dead. But it got a fair bit of press and notoriety at the time, but it still ended up being overshadowed by Tobruk and Kokoda. Mm-hmm. And I think the main reason is because Tobruk, this was the case, 20 years ago, and it's still the case now. Tobruk and Kokoda, just for Australians, they're much more easily identifiable as largely Australian achievements, whereas Alamein, we're just one division out of a dozen,
Yeah, it makes sense.
Professional force. So, yeah, it is a bit disappointing at times that Alamein doesn't get as. I mean, I do what I can to.
Well, you certainly are today. So that's something.
Yeah, I put out stuff at the War Memorial. They've talks. I've written an article, a fairly lengthy article, which will come out next January in our wartime magazine about Alamein, the 80th anniversary. Mm-hmm. Put out stuff on social media through the memorial and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm trying to do my bit to keep its memory alive. I just thought I'd finish. There's just a couple of books, as you mentioned. There's a huge amount of books have been written about El Alamein. I read quite a few, but there's many, many more that I probably will never get to. The one in the centre that's the Australian official history, written by Barton Morn, who was actually a junior officer in the 9th Division at the time, served at Tobruk and El Alamein. The one, the top there, the with the reddish cover, Alamein, the Australian story. Now that was published around the time of the 60th anniversary. Mark Johnston and Peter Stanley. Now I know you've had Mark on your show.
Yeah.
Before. I was that tour that I mentioned. I went to Alamein in 2002. Mark and Peter were the Australian leaders of that tour. And just a couple of weeks after we returned from that tour of Crete and Egypt, that book was published at the memorial, and that's a really good one for the Australian story. The others, I really enjoyed. Philip Warner's is one of the older books, but
it's a classic, isn't it? Yeah.
And Neil Barr and John Latimer's, I thought, were really, really good too.
Yeah, Neil Barr's coming up on most people's lists of the guests in 2 weeks. So that's interesting. Yeah, and so there's lots and lots of books there. But to kind of just to end the things, one of the questions I'm asking everybody this week is to kind of in a paragraph or two sum up your, and maybe speaking on behalf of Australia's, opinion of Montgomery and Rommel. I mean, they've both come up in the conversation, but that's when it's discussed as a battle, everyone has to give their opinion on Montgomery and Rommel. And what's your assessment of Montgomery's handling of the plan and the execution of it, and Rommel's response to it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think Montgomery was the right man at the right time, and I think he did very well. Look, there is some credence to the idea that he had overwhelming strength in numbers and was able to just hammer away at the line. Although the 2-to-1 advantage was probably not quite as strong as I would have liked to have made it. But still, how are you going to fit so many more tanks and guns into that space anyway?
Yeah, and as we always say, attacking is hard, and 2-1 against entrenched fortified positions is not brilliant. I mean, current military doctrine would generally suggest you want to have 5-1 advantage. So yeah, a lot is talked about that advantage, but I think it's not that massive when you're attacking across the kind of terrain that we're talking about.
No, that's right. That's right. I think his handling of the army was pretty good, really. He stuck to his guns. So I think, the optimism that he instilled in the army before the decisive battle, the training regime that they were put through, the communication within the army, they really knew who was boss and what was the program. When the battle opened, kind of predictably, they didn't bash through on the first night, but he didn't panic. He just implemented phase 2 of the plan, which was the turn northwards and crumbling away at the enemy defences, whilst reorganising for another bash to try and break through with the armour. He was pretty critical of the armour, that he didn't feel like they were trying hard enough to get through. So he could be very, very critical of some senior officers and some arms. I mean, God knows, I don't know how the tank guys went through that stuff with, all those advancing into the mouth of so much anti-tank defences. I mean, at least they had Shermans by that stage, but a lot of them were still the inferior tanks with, all those anti-tank guns, mines, and the dreaded 88s ranged against you. I just don't know how they could have had the guts to do it, but they did. How did the engineers have the guts to do their job? I don't know. The infantry, really, really, really tough fighting. So,
well, definitely, and that's what you said at the beginning about the fact that Alamein needs to be seen as part of the Mediterranean battle, but I think it also needs to be seen as the general improving and learning curve. Is that a lot of those British armored units then went on to fight in either Italy or France, and they developed tactics, leadership prospered. The use of artillery, Montgomery then puts that as his kind of staple requirement of any battle when we get to Normandy and totalized and tractable. So it's not just because people are asking about what happened to the Australian involvement. This is the last hurrah for the Australians in North Africa, isn't it? You're off elsewhere. That's right. After this.
Yeah, they know they're going home. Going back to fight the Japanese after.
But the lessons they've learned there are lessons that are taken elsewhere, and by everybody involved in it.
That's right. But more difficult to apply those lessons in the Pacific theatre against the Japanese. It's one of those things that you sometimes wonder about. Whether what if 9th Division had remained with 8th Army as the New Zealanders did?
Yeah, exactly. How that would have gone. And a quick assessment of Rommel.
Rommel, I suppose he was on a bit of a hiding to nothing by the time of El Alamein. I think his usual headstrong tendencies got him into that situation. He went against Axis policy at the time, convinced Hitler, let me race into Egypt and have a crack at Alex, Cairo and the canal. And he got himself into a bad position where he was stuck on the Alamein line, and he couldn't do anything there, really. I mean, he made one last attempt at Alam el Halfa, but then he was pretty much stuck there, and he just had to wait for the blow. So I think they defended as well as they could, and Rommel moved his forces around as well as he could at El Alamein. But a lot of just too risky, headstrong, didn't play well with higher commanders, so he often got himself, he could have spectacular victories, but then he'd get himself into all sorts of terrible trouble.
I mean, and after July and August and the strengthening of the 8th Army and even September, that his it's going to be a matter of time before he's defeated. It's just really a matter of where and when, isn't it now? And this is the question
I think
that's
so.
come
I think
up.
he recognises that too.
Yeah,
I think
is the Alamein necessary, given that the landings in North Africa are just around the corner? But it's whether it's necessary militarily is separate to whether or not it's necessary as a moral victory, as a victory for morale. As we said earlier,
I think so. That's important. Yeah, that's important.
The Aussies need it post Tobruk.
And Churchill certainly would really badly wanted that victory at El Alamein before Torch, and I can see the merit in that.
And final, just quick thing, all you got to do in Europe, if I gather a group of historians together in a pub and we throw Montgomery into the conversation, that's it. That's the evening sorted out. But in Australia, I'm guessing people like Blamey are more fodder for discussion amongst Australian historians, because Montgomery, apart from El Alamein, he's not really involved in anything the Australians are involved with beyond, is he really? So I don't suppose he kind of is as divisive over there. Is that true?
Oh, yeah, you're right. And it's really only El Alamein that where Australians are connected to Montgomery. Look, I think he became a bit of a divisive figure with the way he handled some of the subsequent campaigns. I mean, even starting with the pursuit of Panzer Army immediately after El Alamein, there was plenty of people thought that the pursuit was bungled, and that a lot of people thought, we should have got them all in the bag there and we let them go. And then I think it wasn't helped by some of his post-war writings where he tended to forget that there were others that
that's putting it mildly. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that it was widely recognised. Australians kind of generally don't like that sort of hubris, I suppose. They don't like it in their own people or anyone else either. Although, Montgomery, I think, did say later that he felt that they never could have won that battle the way they did without what the 9th Division did at the second battle of El Alamein. And when he was reflecting upon it, by the same token, he also, I think at one point during the battle, he said to one of his aides that it's the Air Force that's winning this battle for us. So,
well, I mean, it's interesting. I was on the Australian War Memorial Photographic Archive yesterday, and he was there 10 years later, and I think 15 years. Montgomery paid his respects out in North Africa to Australian fallen 10 years on. So he may not have said it very often. Yeah,
he was there in 67. So there's what's that, 25.
So he may have not always vocally given his recognition of other units, but he was there physically, and that's the problem with Montgomery, is that you can find him being complimentary about other units and leaders, but they come one out of every 9 comments where he's praising himself. That's the thing. It's me, oh, and him, me, oh, and them. It's that's the balance.
I think as Alexander famously said to me at some stage after the war, he said, "Well, you've forgotten somebody," and then he said, "Who?" He said, "Well, you've forgotten me."
Yeah, well, that's the story of Normandy and the village that wanted to offer to rename its village in the honor of a junior British officer who'd been on Sword Beach. Says, "Well, you can't name it after me. I'm just a lieutenant." And the captain comes, "You can't name it after me. I'm just a captain." And it goes on. And Montgomery, "Yeah, I'll take it. That's Montgomery, Colville Montgomery, because he's got the pride and the hubris and the whatever it is to accept a village being renamed in his honor. That's the kind of guy Montgomery is, and we're all stuck with the fact that, love him or loathe him, and people do both. He was the commander. He has more successes than failures, and whether or not he's a nice person, as I always say, he's a bit of a dickhead, but he knows what he's doing. Is generally my understanding of Montgomery, but. Anyway, we'll bring things to end, Craig. I mean, it's just a great, amazing debut performance, and you've perfectly given us an overview of the Australian involvement. And love to have you back again. Perhaps the 9th Division in Papua New Guinea would be a nice accompanying show sometime in the future. That'd be good.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's less of a specialty for me.
Or something else.
Most of my focus for the Second World War has really been Mediterranean. So
okay, well, a Mediterranean. We haven't done the kind of Abyssinia campaign. We haven't done that yet, so that's something we go backwards. We've done Crete with a couple of times, but we haven't done Greece much. So there's plenty of opportunity. But anyway, we'll bring things to an end. So, folks, we're going to have Mike Bechtold on tonight or tomorrow morning, depending on where you are, talking about the tactical air power and Conningham and all that. And as for now, Craig, it's been fantastic talking to you, and I can't wait to speak to you again. So, folks, the link to Australian War Memorial is in the description below, so go and check out the archive there and all their exhibits online. They are leading the way in accessibility for archives and reports and after action. That other institutions worldwide take note of how Australia are doing it very well. So thank you very much. I doff my cap to you, Craig, for what you're doing there and making history accessible to everybody.
Thanks, Paul. It's been a pleasure.
Brilliant. Okay, cheers, everybody. See you later on. This is Paul Woodhouse from World War II TV signing off. Cheers. Bye.